Hello everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. 7 years. That's how long Rachel and I had been married when I realized I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a conversation that didn't end in a fight, a cold shoulder, or one of us walking out of the room. I wonder how we got to that point. And the truth is, I can trace the decline with uncomfortable clarity. But what makes it worse is knowing that things didn't start this way. We weren't always this broken. I met Rachel when I was working for a construction company, managing timelines and contractor communications for commercial builds. The work was demanding but stable, and I'd been with the company for 3 years by the time Rachel came into my life. She was working in event planning by coordinating conferences and corporate gatherings. We met online and hit it off. I was drawn to her energy almost immediately. We exchanged numbers that day, and by the end of the week, we'd gone on our first date. The early months were effortless in the way new relationships sometimes are. She'd text me during the day just to check in, and sometimes we'd grab dinner. She cooked for me on weekends. I felt seen and valued in a way I hadn't experienced before. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. She said yes without hesitation as she threw her arms around me. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with close family and friends. It was simple, intimate, and exactly what we both wanted. We honeymooned in the mountains for a week, staying in a cabin with no internet and barely any cell service, and it felt like the beginning of something solid and lasting. The first year of marriage was good. Not perfect because no marriage is. We had our adjustments like any newlywed couple. Learning to share space fully, figuring out how to manage finances together, and navigating each other's quirks and habits. But these were minor things, easily compromised on. We were happy. Or at least, I thought we were. Somewhere around the second year, things gradually change. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just small changes that I noticed, but didn't think much of initially. Her tone, when she spoke to me, became a little sharper. Her patience wore thinner. The way she looked at me sometimes, it wasn't the same warmth I'd grown used to. There was something colder in her eyes, something distant. The fights started over small, mundane things. I'd forget to take the trash out on collection day, and instead of a simple reminder, she'd comment on how I never paid attention to anything she asked. I'd fold the laundry wrong, shirts inside out or towels not lined up properly, and she'd refold it in front of me with an exasperated sigh, muttering about how it wasn't that hard to do it right the first time. I worked long hours during busy project cycles. Construction timelines are unforgiving, and when we were closing out a build, I'd sometimes put in 10 or 12-hour days to make sure everything stayed on schedule. She started commenting on it constantly. I was never home. I cared more about work than I did about our marriage. She was basically living alone. I was always choosing my job over her. I tried to explain that the hours were temporary, that certain phases of a project required more time on site, and that I was working hard to build stability for both of us. But she didn't want to hear it. Or maybe she heard it and just didn't care. At first, I apologized constantly. I apologized for forgetting things, for working late, for not somehow reading her mind when she was upset about something she hadn't actually told me about. I thought if I just kept the peace, if I smoothed things over quickly enough, we'd get through whatever rough patch we were in. But the disrespect didn't stop. It grew. She started making little jabs at me in front of other people. We'd be at a family dinner and she'd make some comment about how I could barely handle anything important. Everyone would laugh uncomfortably, not sure if she was joking or serious. Or we'd be out with friends, and she'd roll her eyes while I was talking and cut me off mid-sentence with a dismissive comment about how I was boring everyone. When we were alone and she was angry, the insults were worse. I'd think to myself during these moments, it's one thing when your wife argues with you. It's another when she looks at you like she despises you. I tried to address it directly, multiple times over the years. I suggested couples counseling, thinking that maybe a neutral third party could help us communicate better. She shot it down immediately, saying we didn't need to pay someone to tell us how to talk to each other. I asked her if something deeper was going on, if there was something about our relationship or her life that was making her unhappy. She wouldn't say. I told her that the constant criticism and sarcasm were wearing me down, that I couldn't keep living in a house where I felt attacked for existing. She dismissed me, saying I was too soft to hear the truth. If I didn't want to be criticized, I should stop giving her reasons to criticize me. It was like talking to a wall. Nothing I said made any difference. By year 5, I'd stopped trying to fix it. I just existed in the marriage. I went to work, came home, ate dinner either in silence or in front of the television, and went to bed. We barely spoke unless it was purely logistical. Who was paying which bill? Whose turn it was to pick up groceries? What time we needed to leave for some family obligation? Our physical relationship had deteriorated, too. Intimacy became rare, then non-existent. Every time I tried to initiate anything, she'd pull away or make an excuse. She was too tired. She had a headache. She wasn't in the mood. She had to get up early. There was always something. Then, about a week before everything came to a head, we had a major fight. It started because I tried to initiate intimacy one evening. We hadn't been physically close in weeks, maybe even a couple of months at that point. I'd lost track. That night, after we'd both gotten ready for bed, I reached for her. She immediately pulled away and told me she wasn't interested. I asked her why, telling her how I felt rejected, and I missed feeling connected to her. That intimacy was important to me in a marriage, and I didn't understand why she kept shutting me out. She turned it into an attack on her. She said I was pressuring her, that I was acting like she owed me something just because we were married, that her body was her own, and she didn't have to explain herself to me. Then I brought up children. It was a topic we'd discussed before we got married. We'd both agreed we wanted kids eventually. But now, she was telling me she changed her mind. She didn't want children anymore. She decided, and that was final. I asked her when she decided this. Why hadn't she talked to me about such a fundamental change in our life plans? Why was she just announcing it now like it was already settled, and my opinion didn't matter? She raised her voice, telling me I was trying to control her, that she didn't need my permission to change her mind about her own life. I raised mine back, telling her that this wasn't just about her life. It was about our life together. That major decisions like this were supposed to be discussions, not unilateral announcements. That's when she shouted that I was acting like she owed me something. I shouted back that I didn't think I was owed anything. I just thought respect came with marriage. She stared at me for a moment, her face hard and angry, then turned and walked out of the bedroom. She went into the guest room and slammed the door so hard that the picture frames on the hallway wall rattled. She didn't speak to me the rest of the night, or the next morning when we passed each other in the kitchen, or the day after that. This had become our pattern over the years. Silent treatments that lasted days. Cold shoulders when we were forced to be in the same room. Sarcastic remarks on the rare occasions she did speak to me. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. I felt like a stranger in my own home, walking on eggshells around someone who was supposed to be my partner. Then came Friday, a few days after that fight. I worked late that day, finishing up some paperwork and coordinating with a contractor about a Monday morning start for the next phase of a project. I left the office around 7:30, which was later than I'd planned, but not unreasonably so. I sent Rachel a text, letting her know I was heading home. Rachel always got home before me. Her job had more predictable hours, and she was usually back by 6 at the latest. Even during our worst periods, she maintained that schedule. When I pulled into the driveway a little after 8, the house was completely dark. No lights on inside. No car in the driveway. I felt a flicker of concern as I got out of my car and walked to the front door. I unlocked it and stepped inside, flipping on the lights in the entryway and living room. The house was empty, silent. I checked my phone. No text from her. No missed calls. I called her number. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I called again immediately. Same result. The concern started shifting into something else, a mix of worry and frustration. It wasn't like her to just disappear without saying anything. We might not have been talking much or getting along, but I usually know her whereabouts. I called a third time, then a fourth. By the sixth call, I was pacing between the living room and kitchen, my stomach tight with unease. By the 10th call, I was genuinely worried. I tried her sister's number. The phone rang and rang. No answer. I called her best friend, Diane. She picked up on the third ring, her voice slightly confused when she answered. I asked if she'd heard from Rachel or if they'd made any plans for the evening. Diane said she hadn't talked to Rachel all day and didn't know where she was. I thanked her and hung up, then stood in the middle of the living room staring at my phone. Part of me was genuinely worried about her safety. What if she'd been in a car accident? What if something had happened and she couldn't call for help? What if she was hurt somewhere? But another part of me, a part one didn't really want to acknowledge, wondered if she was just ignoring me deliberately. If this was another move in whatever silent war we'd been fighting for months. Another way to punish me for some perceived offense I wasn't even aware of. Over an hour passed. I'd stopped calling after the 10th attempt, not wanting to seem desperate or controlling if she was checking her phone and just choosing not to answer. Still nothing. No text. No call. No explanation. Then, finally, a little after 9:30, my phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Rachel. The message read, "I'm not your property. I'll be late. Don't call." I read it once. Then I read it again. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I couldn't quite believe that was what she'd chosen to send after I'd spent over an hour worried about whether she was safe. Not an apology for worrying me. Not an explanation of where she was or why she hadn't responded to any of my calls. Not even a simple reassurance that she was fine. Just a cold, dismissive message that sounded more like something you'd send to an overbearing parent than to your husband. I stood there in the middle of the living room, staring at my phone screen, and every single bottled-up memory of disrespect came flooding back all at once. Every insult she'd thrown at me, every eye roll when I was speaking, every dismissive comment she made in front of friends and family, every time she'd made me feel small or stupid or insufficient, every time she treated me like I was an inconvenience in her life rather than her partner, every rejection, every cold shoulder, every fight where she twisted my words and made me feel like I was the problem. I didn't want to do this anymore. I didn't want to live like this anymore. I didn't want to spend another day walking on eggshells around someone who clearly had no respect for me. I opened the message thread and started typing a reply. "I'm not your husband anymore. Don't come back," was my response. I stared at the message for a few seconds, my thumb hovering over the send button. Then I pressed it and watched the message deliver. I immediately scrolled to my wife's sister's contact and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice friendly and unsuspecting. I didn't let her get through her greeting. I told her directly that I was done with the marriage to her sister, that it was over. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her sister asked what had happened. Her voice had shifted from friendly to concerned and confused. I told her to ask her sister. Then I ended the call before she could respond. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. Then I walked to the bathroom and took a long, hot shower. I stood under the water for at least 20 minutes, letting the heat and steam work through the tension in my shoulders and back. When I finally got out, I dried off slowly, changed into sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and went to lie down on the couch in the living room. I turned on the television without really paying attention to what was on. I just needed the background noise. I felt drained. Then, about 10 minutes after I'd settled on the couch, the peace was completely shattered. My phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, started buzzing. Once. Twice. Then, continuously, one call right after another. I got up and walked over to it, picking it up to see the screen filled with notifications. 20 missed calls. All from Rachel. As I stood there watching, text messages started coming in, one after another. The first one asked what I meant. The second said I was overreacting. The third demanded that I pick up the phone so we could talk. Then came messages saying I couldn't be serious, that this was ridiculous, that I needed to answer her right now. I stared at the screen, watching the messages roll in, and didn't move to respond. I thought to myself, funny how silence suddenly matters when you're the one being ignored. I set the phone back down on the counter, walked back to the couch, and tried to refocus on the television. The calls kept coming. The messages kept coming. I ignored all of them. After the first dozen calls went unanswered, the tone of the text started to change. They became more frantic, more desperate. She asked what was going on. She said she's on her way. We needed to talk about this. She asked me to please just pick up the phone. I didn't. About an hour later, I heard a car pull up outside the house. Then footsteps on the porch, quick and hurried. Then the sound of a key sliding into the lock and trying to turn. The lock didn't budge. Before I'd sat down on the couch earlier, I'd taken my own house key and placed it in the lock from the inside, turning it slightly. It's an old trick. When a key is already in the lock from one side, another key can't engage the mechanism to open it from the other side. Rachel started pounding on the door almost immediately. Hard, repeated knocks that echoed through the quiet house. She called my name through the door, her voice loud and demanding. She told me to open it. I didn't move from the couch. She kept pounding, kept calling out. She said she didn't mean the text the way it sounded. She said she just needed space and didn't appreciate being called 10 times. I stood up slowly, walked to the front door, and spoke through it without opening it. I told her that space was exactly what she'd asked for. And now she had it. There was a brief silence on the other side. Then her voice came back, angry now. She said I was being childish, that I was acting like a child throwing a tantrum. I didn't respond. Then she said that if I didn't open the door right now, she was going to call the police. I stayed quiet. I knew she could call them if she wanted to. Technically, it was her house too. Both our names were on the mortgage. But she never carried through the threat. She kept pounding on the door, kept calling out my name. Her voice shifted between angry and pleading. Then, after several minutes, her tone changed completely. The anger drained out of it, replaced by something that sounded almost like genuine remorse. She said, through the door, that I was right. The text was out of line, that she shouldn't have sent it. She asked if we could please just talk about this like adults. I stood there for a long moment, weighing my options. Then I reached over and turned the key, unlocking the door. I pulled it open. Rachel stood on the porch, her face flushed, her hair slightly disheveled because she had been running her hands through it. She looked genuinely shaken. She stepped inside quickly, as if afraid I might close the door again if she didn't move fast enough. Before I could say anything, she started talking. She said she'd only sent that text because she was still angry about the fight we'd had earlier in the week. She wanted me to feel what it was like to be ignored and dismissed. She wanted to get back at me, to make me understand how she felt. But she admitted she'd gone too far. She'd crossed a line, and she knew it. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, arms crossed, looking at her. She kept talking, filling the silence. She said she knew things had been bad between us. She said she knew she'd been difficult, and that I'd been trying to fix things. She asked me to please talk to her. I shook my head slowly. I told her I didn't want to talk. I wanted to end this. Her face crumpled. She said I didn't mean that. I couldn't mean that. I told her I did, then turned away from her and walked back toward the living room. She followed me, saying she'd do whatever it took. I just couldn't give up on us. I sat back down on the couch and stared at the television, without responding to her. She stood in the doorway between the entryway and living room for a long time, just watching me. Then, eventually, she wiped her eyes and went upstairs to the bedroom. Neither of us slept much that night. I stayed in the guest room. She stayed in the bedroom. The house was completely silent except for the occasional creak of floorboards above me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I sat up, disoriented and stiff from sleeping late. I looked at my phone. It was a little after 9. I heard car doors closing, then footsteps on the porch, then knocking. I got up and opened the door to find my wife's sister standing there with her husband. My wife's sister's face was a mixture of concern and frustration. She asked if we could come in to talk. I stepped aside and let them in. Rachel was already coming down the stairs. She must have heard the car too. We all moved into the living room and sat down. Rachel's sister and her husband took the love seat. Rachel sat in the armchair. I sat back down on the couch. Rachel's sister asked what was going on. She said Rachel had called her late last night, crying and barely coherent, saying I wanted a divorce. She wanted to hear my side. So I explained, factually laying out what had been happening for years. I told them about the constant disrespect, the insults, both private and public, the way she'd criticize everything I did, the way she dismissed every attempt I'd made to address our problems or suggest counseling, the way she'd shut me out physically and emotionally. I told them about the fight earlier in the week, about how she'd unilaterally decided she didn't want children anymore without discussing it with me, even though we'd agreed before marriage that kids were part of our future, about how she'd accused me of trying to control her when I simply asked why she hadn't talked to me about such a major life decision. I told them about last night, about how I'd come home to an empty house and called her 10 times with no answer, genuinely worried that something had happened to her, about the text she'd finally sent, accusing me of treating her like property and ordering me not to call her. I told them that her response to my concern for her safety was the final straw, that after years of being disrespected and dismissed, I had had enough. Rachel's sister and her husband listened quietly throughout. When I finished, they both sat in silence for a moment. Rachel's sister's husband spoke first. He said he hadn't realized things had gotten this bad. That from the outside, they'd seemed like a normal couple with normal problems. Rachel's sister turned to Rachel. She asked if what I'd said was true, if she'd really been treating me the way I'd described. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She stared at her hands in her lap. Then, slowly, she nodded. She said she didn't fully realize how bad it had gotten. She'd felt angry all the time for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, and she'd taken out on me. Rachel's sister and her husband exchanged a look. There was something in that look, some unspoken communication between them. Then Rachel's sister's husband asked if we'd be willing to try counseling before making any final decisions about the marriage. He said that sometimes having a professional help facilitate communication could make a real difference. I was quiet for a long time. Honestly, I was ready to be done. I'd meant what I said the night before. But Rachel's sister and her husband were good people. They'd always been kind to me, always treated me with respect. And I could see that they genuinely cared about both of us. Finally, I said I'd be willing to try counseling. But I was clear that this was the only chance. If things didn't improve significantly, I was done. Rachel quickly agreed. She said she'd do whatever it took. She'd go to every session, work on her behavior, and make real changes. Rachel's sister made some calls that afternoon and found a marriage counselor who had an opening the following week. We scheduled our first appointment. The next few weeks were strange. Rachel and I existed in a state of uncomfortable limbo. We were civil to each other, but distant. She slept in the room, while I was still in the guest room. We didn't eat meals together. We barely talked except about logistical things, who would schedule the counseling appointments, who would pick up groceries, and when we'd both be home. Our first counseling session was awkward. The therapist spent most of the first hour just getting our basic history and understanding what had brought us to her office. She asked each of us to describe our perspective on the marriage and what we felt the main issues were. I was honest. I talked about feeling disrespected and dismissed, about how Rachel's behavior had gradually changed after we got married, about the constant criticism and public humiliation, about feeling like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. Rachel was also honest, though it clearly pained her to admit certain things out loud. She acknowledged that she'd said and done things that were hurtful. She admitted she wasn't sure why she'd become so angry all the time. The therapist listened carefully, taking occasional notes. She didn't take sides or place blame immediately. Over the next several sessions, we started digging deeper. The therapist had us work on communication exercises. She'd have us practice expressing feelings without attacking each other. She'd point out when one of us used language that was inflammatory or dismissive. Slowly, patterns started to emerge. In our fourth session, the therapist asked Rachel about her friendships, about who she spent time with, and what those relationships looked like. Rachel mentioned a few people, but the name that came up most frequently was her best friend, who had been her closest friend for about 7 years. They'd met through work and had bonded quickly. They talked almost every day, went out for lunch or drinks regularly, and confided in each other about everything. The therapist asked about the friend's marital status and found out she had gotten divorced about 2 years ago. Then the therapist asked a question that seemed simple, but opened up something neither Rachel nor I had fully considered. What was her best friend's attitude toward her own marriage and divorce? Rachel hesitated before answering. She said her best friend had been very bitter about her divorce, that her ex-husband had been controlling and demanding, that her best friend felt like she'd lost herself in the marriage and was only now reclaiming her independence. The therapist nodded slowly, then asked what kinds of things Rachel's best friend talked about regarding marriage in general. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She admitted that her best friend often complained about men and marriage, that she'd say things about how husbands always tried to control their wives, how marriage was a trap, how women needed to stand up for themselves and not let men dictate their lives. The therapist asked how often Rachel and her best friend had these kinds of conversations. Rachel said it was pretty frequent, almost every time they got together. Then the therapist asked a pointed question. Had Rachel's attitude toward our marriage changed after her best friend's divorce? Rachel went quiet. I watched her face as she processed the question. I could see something clicking into place in her mind, some connection she hadn't made before. She said slowly and quietly that yes, maybe it had, that she'd started seeing things differently after spending more time with her best friend, that her friend's perspective on marriage and men had gradually become her own perspective without her really realizing it. I sat there absorbing this information. For years, I'd felt like I was living with a different person than the woman I'd married, and I'd never understood why the change had happened. Now suddenly, there was an explanation. The therapist explained something that made sense of it all. She said that when someone we're close to goes through a painful experience like divorce, their pain and bitterness can influence how we see our own relationships. If we're constantly hearing negative messages about marriage from someone we trust, we can start to internalize those messages and apply them to our own situation, even when they don't actually fit. She said it sounded like Rachel's friend, in her own pain and anger about her failed marriage, had been projecting her experiences onto Rachel. That she'd been painting all marriages and all husbands with the same brush she'd used to paint her ex-husband. And that Rachel, as a close friend who cared about her friend and wanted to be supportive, had absorbed those messages without questioning whether they applied to her own marriage. Rachel started crying. This was the crying of someone who'd just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. She said she'd never thought about it that way, that she'd just been trying to save her own marriage by taking lessons from her divorced friend. But in doing that, she let the friend's bitterness poison her own marriage. She turned to me and said she was sorry, that she hadn't realized what was happening, that she'd let someone else's failed relationship convince her that our relationship was failing too, even though the circumstances were completely different. Rachel admitted that she'd started seeing everything I did through that distorted lens. The therapist asked Rachel what she thought about cutting back on her time with Diane, or at least being more mindful about the kinds of conversations they had. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought she needed to cut this friend off completely, that the friendship had become toxic, even if she hadn't seen it that way before. I didn't say anything during this exchange. I just listened. Part of me felt vindicated. I'd known something external was influencing Rachel's behavior, even if I hadn't been able to identify what it was. But another part of me felt sad. Sad that it had taken things getting this bad for Rachel to see what was happening. Sad that years of our marriage had been damaged by someone else's bitterness. Over the following weeks, Rachel followed through on what she'd said. She stopped responding to her friend's calls and texts. When her friend persisted, Rachel eventually sent her a message explaining that she needed space and that their friendship wasn't healthy for her anymore. Rachel's best friend didn't take it well. She sent angry messages accusing Rachel of choosing a man over their friendship. She said Rachel was making a mistake, that I'd probably manipulated her into cutting her friend off, that Rachel would regret this. Rachel blocked her number, then blocked her on social media. I could see how hard it was for her. She had been her closest friend for years, and ending that relationship was painful. But Rachel seemed committed to the decision. We continued with counseling every week. Slowly, I started to see real changes in Rachel's behavior. She worked on her tone when she spoke to me. When she felt herself getting sharp or sarcastic, she'd pause and rephrase what she was saying. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes it was obviously effortful. But the fact that she was trying meant something. She stopped criticizing small things. When I forgot something or did something differently than she would have done it, she'd either let it go or mention it calmly, without making it into a character flaw. She started asking about my day again and actually listened to the answers. She'd follow up on things I'd mentioned in previous conversations. She seemed genuinely interested in my life again. Physical intimacy started to return gradually. Not immediately and not all at once, but slowly. A hand on my shoulder when she passed by. Sitting closer to me on the couch while we watched TV. Eventually, after about 2 months of counseling, I moved back into our bedroom. One evening, about 3 months into therapy, we had a real conversation about the issue of children. Not an argument, an actual conversation. Rachel explained why she'd changed her mind about wanting kids. She said she was scared. Scared of losing herself in motherhood. Scared of what pregnancy and childbirth would do to her body. Scared of how it would impact her career. Scared of not being a good mother. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her I understood her fears. Those were real concerns, and I didn't want to dismiss them. But I also told her that these experiences she's scared of weren't universal. That plenty of women had children and maintained their identities and careers. That we could make decisions together about how to balance parenthood and work. That I'd be an active partner in parenting, not someone who expected her to do everything while I focused on my career. I told her I still wanted children eventually, but that I wasn't going to pressure her or give her an ultimatum. I'd rather we table the discussion for now and focus on rebuilding our foundation. Once we were in a better place, we could revisit the conversation and make a decision together. She seemed relieved by that. She thanked me for understanding and for not pushing. Small positive moments started returning to our daily lives. Things that had disappeared years ago gradually came back. She started waiting for me to get home from work sometimes, greeting me at the door like she used to when we first got married. We'd talk about our days while she made dinner or while we made it together. We had conversations that didn't turn into fights. We could disagree about something without it spiraling into accusations and insults. We could express frustration without attacking each other. I noticed the difference in her entire demeanor. She seemed lighter, less angry, more like the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. But I also remained cautious. I couldn't forget how bad things had gotten. I couldn't forget the years of disrespect and the night I'd almost walked away for good. I couldn't unhear the things she'd said to me or unsee the looks she'd given me when she was at her worst. The therapist warned us both that rebuilding trust takes time, that Rachel's behavioral changes were significant and positive, but that I'd need time to believe they were permanent, that it was normal for me to be wary, to watch for signs that things might slip back into old patterns. Rachel understood that. She told me several times that she knew she'd damaged the marriage severely and that she didn't expect me to trust her again overnight. She said she was willing to be patient and to prove through consistent actions that she changed. 6 months after that night when I'd locked her out, we were in a much better place. Not perfect. No marriage is perfect, but functional. Respectful. Sometimes even happy. We still went to counseling, though we'd reduced it to twice a month instead of every week. The therapist said we were doing well and that the progress was real and sustainable. Rachel had maintained her boundaries with her friend. This friend had tried to reach out a few more times over the months, but Rachel hadn't responded. Eventually, She seemed to give up. I noticed that Rachel had also become more selective about her friendships in general. She'd pulled back from a couple of other friends who had similar attitudes to the friend she cut off. She started spending more time with friends who had healthy relationships. Rachel's sister became someone she talked to more frequently. The changes in who she surrounded herself with seemed to reinforce the changes in her behavior. She wasn't hearing constant negative messages about marriage anymore. She wasn't being encouraged to see every request or concern from me as an attempt to control her. But despite all the improvements, I maintained a firm boundary in my own mind. I'd given the marriage a second chance because Rachel had shown genuine remorse and had committed to real change. Because she'd followed through on cutting off the toxic influence in her life. Because she'd put in the work in counseling and in our daily interactions. But I'd also made myself a promise that night when I'd sent that text message and locked the door. If the disrespect ever returned, I wouldn't hesitate to leave. I wouldn't wait for things to get as bad as they'd been before. I wouldn't give endless chances. I'd given her one chance to fix what she'd broken. That was more than many people would have given. But one was the limit.